How would you differentiate between what people are doing thinking it's good listening versus what active listening really is? Or like,
I would start by saying, are you listening to respond, but you're willing to be passive and patient, but you're already thinking about what you're saying? Versus, are you listening to understand? And are you remaining curious? And are the questions you respond with just rooted in curiosity rather than having an ulterior motive of getting to the part of the conversation that you are invested in?
Yeah, I think often as leaders, we go through our days so quickly and we're always looking ahead to what's next on our agenda. I think about my schedule and it's meeting after meeting after meeting. It's so easy to be in a conversation with someone and want to get to the next point. And so to me, the difference between active listening and listening is exactly that. Are you listening to what someone's presenting to you in who they are in that moment, or are you just listening to get to that next moment? And so to me, that's really the essence that's there for them. And what are you trying to get out of that conversation? Is it about what's in it for you, or is it what's there for the employee?
How hard is it in your day to be in that mindset of curiosity and understanding?
Impossible. Whether it's the current dynamic of hybrid work, whether it's mounting pressures around what's asked from them in a day to day and balancing what they have on their home front. There's so much that people need to get done in a day. And I think increasingly leaders are facing tremendous challenges. It's really difficult to show up and really be present for employees. And it's something you have to do very intentionally. Unless you're very focused and, set that time aside to really take a minute, reset, and show up for your employee, whether it be in your one-on-ones, whether it be in a performance conversation, to reset and really understand what the intention of that conversation is, then you're not really taking the time to focus.
I think that active listening is truly a discipline. Mm-hmm. It is something that we have to work so hard at. And our world is not set up to encourage that. Everything moves at such a quick pace, a blistering pace, really. Things are so frenetic, everything's staccato. There's so many interruptions and disruptions, and we've just accepted that as part of normal life. There used to be a time where taking your phone into a meeting and looking at it during a meeting was absolutely a faux pas. Mm-hmm. And now it is absolutely the normal. People are on their phones all the times in meetings. We have become so enamored with multitasking that it takes Herculean effort to step away from that and say, no, this is time where I am giving probably the singular greatest gift you can give to someone, my attention. You get my presence and you get my attention. And I need to stop everything else that's running. And it is so difficult because the reality is, even physiologically, when we're in the middle of our work days, we are revved up. Like we are being peppered with stress hormones and go, go, go. And our pulse is fast. Our heart rates are fast. We're thinking fast. And to really pump the brakes on that and step away, it just takes so much active effort. Active listening is an active effort. It can be the hardest thing we do, and yet the most meaningful, the most impactful.
The fact that you just said that it can be like a Herculean effort, like the amount of energy that it takes inside your workday to be in the state of active listening. When we think about that, what are some of the go-to strategies that you both use to step into that whenever your presence, the gift of your presence, is required?
Yeah, I know for me, one of the things that really was important was taking time out of my day to reset. So whether that was taking 5 minutes to go out for a quick walk, make myself a cup of tea, just getting a change of pace, a change of scenery to just slow things down. I think to Lorelai's point, it's so easy to get caught up in a pace that is just unsustainable. Just slowing things down and resetting, hitting stop, and taking a breath was really, really important. And then going into conversations with my staff, particularly one-on-ones, I always took a couple minutes to reset myself, because I think, to your point, being present, making sure you're showing up, not just to get the check marks of what's getting done on their to-do list, but really showing up to make sure you understand what's a priority for them, where they're going, and what you can do to support them is critical.
Yeah, I share with Kelly that one of the best practices is to step away and reset. Sometimes it's going for a walk. Sometimes for me in the office, it's been going and finding one of those quiet rooms and actually sitting in it with the lights off. And so far, no one has ever walked in on me sitting in a dark room in the workplace.
Yeah.
But sitting in with, the lights off, so that it's almost like I'm creating a bit of a stimulation free environment so that I can just breathe and center and get off that rat race treadmill pace that I'm on. One of my colleagues years ago said he keeps a sheepskin mat in his office, and before he has to go into a difficult conversation, he rolls out the mat and he sits on the floor and he meditates for a few moments. And I thought, if he can do this, and if he can share this as one of his winning strategies,
Yeah.
I can do something that's similar to that. And I do think that meditating, deep breathing, just really conscientiously saying, okay, stop, disconnect, put myself into a different space, a space of readiness for this conversation, in order to give that gift, and in order to be ready to receive the information that's coming in, and as prepared as a person can be for expecting the unexpected. Because sometimes these conversations go in a completely different direction than we're expecting them to.
Yes.
And if we are centered and prepared for that conversation, then we will be more likely to have the wisdom to respond in the right way, or to say, I need to defer the outcome of this, because that's also really hard to do as well. It's a half an hour in our schedule and we have a certain intention for what that conversation is going to accomplish. And we want to just be able to check the box and move on to the next thing. And if what someone brings us is news or information or an attitude, something that we're not expecting, we still somehow want to conclude that conversation, check the box, and move on. And sometimes the wise and the right thing to do is to say, okay, let's take this conversation somewhere else another time. Let's schedule more time to explore this. Or I, as the leader, need to take time to do some more research into this. So I need to defer this outcome. It's not going to happen today the way I thought it was going to. I think that's a really important element as well.
Yeah.
But I think to build on that, actually, you just made me think, Lorelai, to align with that, I think comes with ruthless prioritization, right? It's so easy to have the list of things to do grow, right? There's a never ending amount of work. You can always take on more. What I have learned is that when things start to get to a point where it's too much, one of the tactics that I use is to just prioritize, right? And when my team has felt overwhelmed, I will go to my boss and say, okay, here's what we have. This is our capacity. If you want us to take this on, what comes off? So when the unexpected arises, you have a teammate that comes up and needs to go on a sick leave, or, something that comes out of the blue, you're able to use that and say, like, these are my priorities. Now what? Right? Because I think that becomes a really useful tool for your supervisors, senior leaders to then say, okay, this is how we manage going forward.
And I think being ruthless with priorities, but then gracious with people.
Yeah.
And so often we have the priorities in the wrong order. The tasks always come first, the deadlines, the diary dates. That's like the God that we are always appeasing all the time.
Yeah.
It would be so much easier for all of us to say sorry to a task or a taskmaster than to a human being that you didn't deal with well. A lot of these deadlines and diary dates, they're self-imposed, they're arbitrary. Someone just set a deadline. And if what's happening in the workplace with people means that you can't meet that deadline or that diary date, then better to take your lumps on saying, I busted that deadline, but I made time for the people who are actually doing the work to meet that deadline. We get it the wrong way around.
Yeah.
And we will do everything. We'll pride ourselves on meeting the deadlines and never letting a task slip, trying to do all the things about the priorities at the expense of the people. And so there's management and there's leadership. And I think that's where we sometimes don't fully evolve into the leadership role
Mhm.
because we master the management role.
I'm hearing that, going back to what you're saying, is it safe to say that you can be a manager and not a leader?
Absolutely.
Whenever we think about this active listening piece, it's the leaders that have this skill, the true leaders. What you both were just speaking to was an intentional practice that you evoke when it's time. It's a nervous system reset, essentially, for the language that we're familiar with. There's not a lot of people in my experience who I have encountered that if I'm about to go into their office, there's not somebody right in front of me. I'm not seeing them take 5 minutes to reset themselves and have a conversation with me. Is that something that you're able to do on the regular in your workplaces, or is it just a nice to have?
Ideally, it would be the regular. It's even a requirement that we prioritize those conversations and we have enough situational awareness, ideally, to know which ones really are going to demand that we do that active work of being prepared and present. But sometimes we're still flying by the seat of our pants. And then that's when, if someone comes in and we really recognize that we're not being present, or they brought more to the table than we thought we were going to be discussing, to say, can we defer this to another time? Or can we discuss this element? Like maybe there's an element of the conversation that's a little more tactical. Can we discuss this element in the time that we have here today, and then put off the other part for another day, and then get ourselves sorted for that other part?
Conversation.
And we can go into lots of conversations about how incumbent it is on leaders to do the self-care that allows us to keep coming back and stepping into that fray time and time again, and being the best that we can be for our people. And that takes so much effort as well. And it takes knowing ourselves and knowing when our cup is empty, knowing when we're at our tippy point, recognizing when that agitation and that irritation or the impatience is bubbling just below the surface and it's threatening to break through, knowing when we're out of spoons, to use the spoon analogy, and then stepping back. And again, sometimes it's about being ruthless in prioritizing even in our personal lives. I want to be all things to all people. I want to have hobbies. I want to read, and I want to have a clean house, and I want to have perfect gardens, and I want to have a clean car. And you know what? Not all of that can happen, because I also need time to rest and rejuvenate and be ready to step back into the office on Monday. And so that means maybe I'm not playing 18 rounds of golf, and I'm not working out all the time, and I'm spending more time reading, which feels lazy, but yet it's one of those things that actually helps me to reset. More of the prioritization that needs to take place outside of the workplace as well.
Yeah. And that self-awareness piece.
Yeah, exactly. Part of this is self-awareness, right? I think it can feel really idealistic when you're in the trenches and you're overwhelmed and you're maybe on the verge of burnout. Feeling like you can even step away for 5 minutes to just reset can feel really idealistic. A lot of this can sometimes just be too much. I can remember many, many days where just getting out of my office for 5 minutes felt impossible, let alone the thought of like getting outside of the building. I'm conscious that when I say these things as resets, like for some people who may be feeling like there's just too much in over their head, it's almost like laughable, but it is possible. And I think when you're able to sort of do that work and understand for you, what is that thing? Like it might not be a walk, it might not be a meditation, but what is the thing that gives you that moment of rest that can give you the energy you need to go on for the next couple hours? It makes a huge difference.
So with this in mind, this main question that I wanted to bring to the both of you today was around active listening. I love what you said about being gracious with people. Okay. So let me paint the picture. We've got a conflict happening. You're the leader. Why is active listening so important when you're presented with conflict in the workplace? What's its role?
One of the things that I have found with active listening is it builds such trust. In my experience, really listening to people and giving them the space to just show up as their whole self and allowing me to just be present has built really strong relationships built on trust. When you look at scenarios where conflict arises, there, I think active listening plays such an important role because people feel comfortable. When you're in an active listening stance, it allows you not to jump to conclusions. It allows you to listen, not assume, not make judgments, not like misrepresent something that someone said, because you're listening. No intention, no bias. You're just there to listen. When you're coming to a situation from that perspective, there's the trust already built. You're already on a different playing field, right?
And I think that people just so want to be seen and heard, and to be able to come in a safe space with a trusted person who's listening to them, to be able to spill the beans on what it is that's bothering them or agitating them or how they feel hard done by. Sometimes that in and of itself, to give them the time to just bleed that out, to have that cathartic release where you don't stop them, you don't halt them, you don't try and bookend what they're saying, couch it in some sort of way, and you just let them talk on about it. There's something so remedying for people just in that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the be all and the end all. Okay, this problem is solved and we can go on.
Right.
But for someone to just have that platform where they get to say, this happened and then this happened and then someone said this and then this bugged me and I always feel like this, as the leader, the manager, it gives you all kinds of great intel about what is really happening and what is really going on.
Right.
And Kelly, you spoke about the biases and the beliefs. Like, we're all walking in with a somewhat predetermined expectation of who's in the right and who's in the wrong and how this should be resolved and how we're going to resolve it as the boss. And then you sit and actually start listening and you realize, holy smokes, I was seeing that through my own lens. I did not have a really great understanding of this. And now that I'm hearing more about it, I can think of a better way to deal with this, or I understand a piece of this that I didn't see before. So you're getting all this great intel and input, but the person across from you also is having this opportunity to speak without being stopped, paused, limited in what they're allowed to share. I think there's just something so helpful in that. Is to say, you're important enough that you get to talk right now, and I'm not going to stop you, and I'm not going to get in your way. Tell me. I mean, we always think the 3 greatest words you can say to someone are I love you, but tell me more is a good second.
Yes. I agree with you. So thinking about whenever you're in that position, if you have a colleague or an employee who happens to report to you and they're in front of you and they're speaking this way and they're telling you about the things that are problematic and whatever is in front of them. When you are in an active listening stance, what do you think from your perspective? What's going on with you?
Well, this recently happened to me. I've had a scenario at work, and, I think it really depends on the situation, right? From a leader's perspective, you're evaluating what the gravity of the situation is. Is this a regular interpersonal issue? Is this more serious? Is there a need to be documenting and reporting the issue? And what kind of issue is it? Is it harassment? Is there a sexual harassment issue? Like, you're instantly in your employer mode trying to figure out what you need to do and what your responsibilities are. So I think there are your duties. And, we were talking before about leader versus manager. And I think you're always juggling those two hats, right, as a leader. And so I think some ways you're switching into that manager role to sort of think, okay, what are my responsibilities here? You're listening, you're actively listening, but you're also very carefully listening to understand what you need to be doing here in terms of your role as an employer.
To go back to the beginning of our conversation where we talked about how much effort active listening takes, for me in those situations, there's so much inner churn going on. And then that's why I need to just continue to be disciplined about continuing to listen when I've got that churn going on. In my head, I'm going through, is it a code of conduct? Is it harassment? Are they making this up? Did that really happen? And to just continue to come back to being a vessel for what they're saying and being curious and knowing that I can defer judgment. We can end this conversation and I can just end it with, okay, thank you very much. There's more to this. And this is where we're ending with this today. And then go back and start pouring through the policies and the procedures or speaking to someone else or conferring on something or doing my own research about where is this at exactly and what is my next best step.
Yeah, there's some really fascinating practices that come from positive psychology around sort of working on your thoughts during that overthinking cycle. And I think those types of practices come in handy in these types of moments, because you do have responsibilities as an employer, and active listening becomes all that more important, right? To sort of tune out your own thoughts, to your point, Lorelei, like shut down anything else that's going on in your own mind and really sort of focus on the here and now and what's being said, so that you can make sure you're not missing anything in these critical kind of moments.
When we think about the conflict iceberg, you've likely seen it. For people who might not know, there's a lot of different elements, but the first we see is the issue. And then you've got belief systems and worldviews. And usually at the base of that is values. And you touched on it a little earlier in terms of knowing your values. But what would you both say is so important inside of conflict conversations in the workplace and understanding your values? What would you say how that role plays for you?
I think that it's so important, a bit of a lost in our culture, to actually identify our own core values. So, of course, we have corporate values. Yes, we have cultural values. We have values and mores and principles and things that have been handed to us through our family and our religious and our educational institutions. But to really know, like, what is it for me that are my core values? And then how do I use those as my guiding light to get through these situations? And when I'm up against a difficulty, how do I look back on those core values and say, if I am true to my core values, and I've already done the time and put in the work to know that these are my core values, my, non-negotiable core values, then how would I proceed through this while being still affixed to and guided by these core values? That's really important. And we just don't typically take a lot of time to know what our core values are. And then that's when it gets easy to just get swept into, I suppose, mastering that management role, where we're just kind of like, these are the procedures and these are the policies, and I'm just exacting the procedures and the policies. And then you get to difficulties and it's hard to navigate them without knowing, but who am I and what's the legacy that I would lead, and how would I engage in this and be proud of myself? Because that's the other thing that happens when you're in these conflict situations, is sometimes you're listening to what someone's bringing to the table, and it's so easy to become defensive or to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did something that made someone feel like this, or that I tolerated a situation in my team that made someone feel like this. And then, you're starting to beat yourself up in the middle of a conversation. And, there's a lot of reflection that needs to happen as a leader too. And the best way to help ourselves, like human beings with all kinds of foibles, living in these stressful, complicated lives, to avoid missteps, is to know what our core values are, and then how to take steps forward and decisions that are aligned with those core values. And it's never going to be perfect at all. Life is a messy business. But I think we come out less scathed if we say, I might not have handled it in the best way possible, but I handled it in the way that I best could as per my values at that particular time. And now that I know more, I do better the next time.
It's like such a nice thought, like knowing that you could have a conversation with somebody who's so anchored in that belief. It makes it better for the person on the other side too, because you're speaking with integrity, you're speaking with alignment, and you are listening from a place of alignment, and you're doing the work so that the other person can understand that they're not just speaking to avoid. They're not speaking to somebody who just wants to finish the conversation or wrap this up or get this off the plate or fix it.
I really think people go into leadership because they want to make a difference, right? They want to have an impact. They want to be a change maker. But there are so many pressures on leaders today, and there is so little priority placed on doing the work, getting to know yourself, identifying your values, being aware of who you are. And without self-awareness, a leader can't lead a team, because how can you help people grow and develop if you don't know who you are? It's such a miss in terms of how we do leadership development when we don't anchor into self-awareness.
Absolutely.
Kelly, going back to whenever you were saying that at times for many leaders, it may feel idealistic to step into integrity and know your values and be able to really truly step out if you need to do the resets we were talking about. What's the cost of remaining in status quo and saying no when you know that you need to be doing something different?
The cost is high. The cost is burnout. Could be sacrificing time with your family and friends. It's high. I've been there. I spent years deciding to just plow ahead at work at the cost of being the mom I wanted to be at home, at the cost of, showing up for family and friends. It's a really high trade-off to maintain status quo. You need to think, where do your priorities lie?
If I can add to that as well, I think in the workplace as well, the cost of continuing on status quo is making mistakes, alienating yourself from employees, reputational damage when you just plow ahead and you make some unwise choices. The cost is having to spend a whole bunch of time in HR processes because you've got constant churn and turnover, because you can't secure employees because they don't want to work for someone who's just plowing ahead and accepting that as the norm.
The norm, yeah.
So there's all kinds of costs, and it might work for you today and for 3 weeks and for 6 months. It might even work for you for 6 years, but there are costs that will be borne for that. And, we won't even get into the physiological costs of living under that kind of stress all the time. And for me, a situation that happened several years ago when I was quite stressed out about things that were happening in the workplace is I kept showing up to work and doing the same things day after day, despite the little voice whispering in the back of my head that it was unsustainable. And it was only when my hair started falling out in clumps that I stood up and took notice and really said, yeah, this can't continue, or I am going to have patchy hair all over my head. And if this is what's happening on my scalp, what else is happening elsewhere for me?
Yeah.
And, we know the statistics show that leaders, executives have higher rates of illness, whether it be mental illness or physical illness, cancer, heart disease. So the evidence is there. There's a high cost to people personally, let alone their family life.
Yeah. So let's say you are both leaders that have taken this stand of wanting to be more mindful and aware, and you're taking the approach of active listening with your employees, but you're part of a greater management team. You're part of a kaleidoscope of humans that are also in decision-making roles that may not share the way that you have been trained. You're both certified coaches. You've taken the road to be these active listeners, in touch with your values, aligned with your integrity. How does it work when you're on a team with other people who are in leadership that are not taking that approach? What does that do to you?
I think it's difficult to be the person who feels like you're not in step or you're not in sync with what's happening. But if you just stay the course and stay true to yourself, then you don't have to suffer with a misalignment with who you are. You don't have to suffer from excessive amounts of imposter syndrome. And the more you go out into the world being genuinely yourself, the more you will find your allies and the people who are aligned to you, because they are looking for those people too. And you'll all start to come out of the woodwork and identify yourselves to one another.
Right.
If you recognize that you're going to be out of step with the culture that's going on, but is going to work for you and how you are going to be able to lead as your best self, stay the course and just have faith that you are either what's meant to be in that situation in order to breathe new life, new approach, new behavior into that situation. Or if it gets unmanageable, well, then you need to leave and take your gifts and assets somewhere else eventually. But I really do think that when we're being authentic and when our intentions are right, we just can't ever go wrong with being ourselves in the workplace. And so much of the self-doubt and the overthinking and the wearing of a mask and all of the things that are a really high cost to us, like there's a ton of energy cost that goes into that, that starts to fall away. And then you just think, I couldn't ever go back to pretending to be someone that I wasn't for the sake of earning the accolades of my boss, my superiors, my colleagues, because it's too high of a personal cost.
Yeah. And I want to give you an example of that. So when I came back from my burnout leave, I was very transparent when I left on burnout, and have always been very transparent about my mental health. And, one of the things that was probably the most impactful for me was, I came back, I had new boundaries of steel about what I would accept, what I wouldn't accept, ruthless prioritization of workload. But one of the things that was the most impactful for me was one of my managers said to me, it was a relief for me to see that there was a little bit of magic happening behind the curtain, because she couldn't understand how I was able to keep the pace I was keeping. And that really hit me, because what I realized is that I wasn't modeling wellness for my team. I wasn't being a good leader for my team. And so that was such a motivation for me to switch what I was doing, change how I showed up at work. And more so than probably anything else about my own well being, drove me to really push those boundaries, continue to drive workplace well being throughout sort of my workplace more generally, not just for me, but for everyone.